First, let me thank French American Foundation Charles and his staff here in New York, as well as in France, for this amazing gift to travel to Paris and Marseille last month for 5 days with 5 other extraordinary colleagues from around the country. To see a part of Paris, even though I've been there before, in an entirely different way, and to see Marseille for the first time. So thank you so very much for the opportunity. It really was extraordinary. By a quick way of background, and like Charles suggested that the topic of sustainability was in my wheelhouse. I'm trained and licensed as an architect. I'm practicing in the private sector. I've been a city planning director in cities, DC, Newark, and now have my own consulting practice. I just finished a comprehensive plan for Detroit and shrinking cities as the program called them legacy cities, we call them here. Shrinking is a dicey term here in the US, was one of the sustainable cities topics. But right now I'm spending a lot of time launching a new design center at the City College of New York. It's called the J. Max Bond Center on Design for the Just City. And I wanted to bring that up because I think over the last decade, perhaps, sustainability has transitioned into resiliency, is transitioning into who knows what. And what I find consistent over the last 10 years across these different cities is there remains this underpinning and this foundational set of challenges that really have to deal with urban justice and social justice. And those link back to economic justice, they link back to environmental justice, they link back to issues of resiliency and climate change. And so we at our center have been talking about this notion of what makes for a just city, what makes for just neighborhoods, what makes for just systems, whether they be social or infrastructure. So the opportunity to travel to France last month, and the theme of 2013 was arts and culture, provided me an interesting opportunity to examine this notion of just city and the way in which the value of arts and culture helps to create just communities and just citizens and access to these things that enrich our lives. So I thought I'd just give you some reflections, as I was instructed to do. Both some quick ones and perhaps some that might engender some conversation as a couple of takeaways. Some of the quick highlights is just an overview of the program agenda. We're there for 5 days. There are 6 of us. We saw 11 venues over 5 days in 2 cities. We met with everyone from deputy mayors and elected officials to folks working in community arts. We learned to drink twice a day, both lunch and dinner, which was new for many of us. We didn't get it the first lunch, but by the second day, we were all in. It remained about 50 degrees warmer than it was here in the US, which was quite pleasant, and we were told that we had sunny days every day in Paris, which was unusual for that time of year, so we felt very fortunate. We got used to this thing known as hors d'oeuvres for lunch. So instead of the big box lunches you get here with the appetites, we had these lovely little snacks that were quite fulfilling. We learned about, and this was maybe personally interesting to me, the really complex identity issues and conversations that happen in France around ethnic cultural identity, and particularly in Marseille. Every other person we talked to, everyone was French, or they embraced the Mediterranean, and there was clearly this very interesting tension. And for me personally, it was very striking to learn that the country doesn't track ethnic communities. So the Americans were talking a lot about communities, and we got these sort of quizzical looks, and when we tried to delve into that a little bit more, the look became a little more stern across the brow. We later learned that this is not a demographic that's tracked in this way. This became a theme of conversation across everything we looked at related to culture in terms of access, inclusion, diversity, and this notion again of just city. I got to see the fabulous Corbu exhibit that had been in my backyard here in New York at MoMA, and I never got to see, but I got to see on the waterfront of Marseille, and that was quite nice. And I just gained a great appreciation for the French-American staff, because at one point we were trying to stage a revolt to go out to see one of the Le Corbusier developments in Marseille, but the schedule didn't allow, and they were quite gracious in telling us no several times. On a more serious note, though, I guess maybe just a couple of differences or larger sort of key takeaways that we thought were interesting across this very broad spectrum of arts and cultural venues that we saw. So for example, we saw everything from the construction site of the new Philharmonic facility being built at Parc de la Villette by renowned architect Jean Nouvel, to everything to a community arts center in Marseille, which housed different arts organizations, including an organization that taught people how to be better street performers. It's like a whole curriculum around that, which we found very interesting. And across all of those different sort of spectrums, from the high art to the low art of culture, it was clear that the value at the federal level, at the national level of arts and culture was so completely different than here. It is of a value as education is, as Charles talked about, as healthcare is talked about. It is a right. So when we talk about the just city and rights to the city, this is deeply embedded in the French culture, and this really struck us as Americans as quite impressive. We were quite jealous, because there was such a tremendous amount of public investment in every single venue that we saw, in addition, not only in its construction and initial capital investment, but also in its operations and sustaining it as a part of the everyday life of French people. The other difference that we saw, and this came about through our interaction with our French colleagues that we were with every day at these different venues, and they were in Seattle this year, 6 colleagues, I think a few weeks before us, but they remarked upon the US culture of entrepreneurialism, in that it is not as easy, they felt, that someone could just sort of, we could get together and figure out how to do something and make it successful and profitable. That there wasn't the same kind of nimbleness to be entrepreneurial, even at the level of arts and culture. And this was something that they admired. And this, I guess, in closing, kind of takes me back to this notion of community, where I think at every venue we ended up having some interesting conversations about what that meant. For example, in Marseille, which was this year's World Cultural Capital, we were really very interested in how these investments in these venues that were completely transformative from a city perspective in terms of urban planning were really engaging a fairly high population of immigrants. I think 50% of the city is an immigrant population. And how, as we looked at these venues, which were spectacular pieces of architecture, were reflective of the majority of their, or at least half of their population. So we were very interested in that. And the discussions with the French about how in some cases that was very normalized as everything is French, versus at the same time wanting those cultural expressions to come forward. So there was a lot of great dialogue and exchange in that, despite some of the language barriers and the time for translation. And I think, as Charles said, we do sort of live in a bubble here, and we're very used to, especially in my field of urban planning, there's a lot of export of art practices. We're beginning to see that in India and other parts of the world. And I think there's still so much that we can be learning, perhaps, to address some of our just city issues. And arts and culture and the way it's valued in French was certainly a great example of that. So thank you.